Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Louis J. Chiaramonte's Mumming in Deep Harbour, Aspects of Social Organization in Mumming and Drinking. This was a chapter in sort of a classic folklore anthology, Halpert and Stories, Christmas Mumming in Newfoundland. I believe the subtitle is Essays in Anthropology, Folklore, and History. And it's really one of the first announcements, as it were, within the context of Canadian folklore. I'll put a little pin in the idea of Canadian folklore, of this new blend of deep, concerted fieldwork in actual lived locations put into the context of the historical record, put into the context of the within the auspices of the folk revival and the folk interest and the rebirth of interest in folk cultures. So it has to do with, the whole book has to do with mummering or mummying or jannying, or goes by a number of terms, which is basically the house visit. It's an old practice, and it is echoed in such things as trick-or-treating. It's echoed in such things as, in the Acadian tradition, mi carême. It is people who go from house to house in disguise. By virtue of being in disguise, and by virtue of it happening only at specific times of day, they are able to contravene the typical social expectations and social mores that we have in interaction. You can go and you can demand to be fed, or demand drinks, or expect at least to get drinks. The demand is not necessarily present, and it is an adult thing as much as it is a child thing. And in England, they'll sometimes have the mummers play, and it's an actual, there's an actual sort of script, and they go from place to place, sometimes from pub to pub, and they'll perform it. It's a St. George and the Dragon-based play. We have that in bits and pieces in Canada, but basically it's just this opportunity at particular auspicious times in the calendar to go from house to house and contravene the normal ways of being in the world. With one's friends and neighbors, and playing jokes, playing tricks, playing fun. So Chiaramonte he's an anthropologist. He was from Boston, born in Boston, but his mother was a Newfoundlander, and he was just one of many people who are using Newfoundland as a field site. And that's why I just wanted to put a pin in the idea of Canadian folklore. Because in this anthology, if one reads all the authors, there's only one person in this anthology who's actually Canadian, let alone a Newfoundlander. One Newfoundlander. And everyone else is from outside. So there is just, it's largely irrelevant to the discussion, but it's always good to bring up. The study of folklore in Canada, and the study of folklore in Newfoundland in particular, had been overwhelmingly done by either Americans or the English, and the folklore faculty was, in its early days, was replete with people who were either American or English, and there was a sense, a general sense, that it took a while to build, but a sense that maybe this should also be an object of study that Canadians and Newfoundlanders themselves are studying. Do we need someone from out of town? Are they? What happens when we are not necessarily representing ourselves? When our voices are not necessarily heard? It's not an entirely perfect argument, but there is a case to be made about it, where you have basically a culture that is now slowly beginning to understand itself as somehow drawing the attraction of out-of-towners and kind of being asked to perform. That they are still this folk society. It's like, no, well, the people in this quote-unquote folk society are equally capable of reflecting critically on this folk society and examining it and so on. The counter argument is that there weren't departments of folklore in Canada and Newfoundland until this time, and there just wasn't a critical mass of trained people to do it. So perhaps it was an inevitable lag. But it's a question it's a statement, and it's something that we can suggest is at least a point of concern before we move on. We don't need to worry about it too much. But this book that came out in '69 was sort of a, hey, there's something really fascinating that's going on here, and we can look at these quaint customs. And we'll use the word quaint, and I know exactly the connotation that has. We'll look at these quaint customs, and we'll see if we do the deep ethnography, we'll see that something else is happening. And Chiaramonte's larger project, and what became his dissertation, was basically on the social dynamics of these small towns, the social dynamics of Deep Harbour, which is a pseudonym for a particular Newfoundland outpost on the south coast. A small village, what's the numbers? 338 residents at the time of this, and 65 houses. A very, very small community, but still a complex a complex one with a rich engagement and a rich system of interaction. And he was interested in the most part in how those sort of economics with a small e was sustained. How communities collaborate, how they are in competition, and how social structures facilitate or act as obstacles to those kind of things. And then this seminar is sort of a day-long presentation about mumming, and then a subsequent conference that Halpert organized came up. And so it's an opportunity for Chiaramonte to take the general idea of the organization of towns and see how that is both informs and is reinforced through these activities that simultaneously seem to be subversions of how they normally go. Because in the main, the communities are defined by families, by households, and that you can look at these, this outport as just a collection of households that have a really strong sense of unity and coherence and cohesiveness. And I can't remember exactly how he phrases it. I can look it up. But as defined in contrast to other homes. It's an us, them. It doesn't mean that they are hostile towards outsiders. It just means that their unit is sort of very sealed off. The borders are firm. And he suggests that, you see that, and that the moment a stranger enters in, or, a non-family member enters into the household, all conversation stops. It's directed towards that person, and it resumes without, once they leave, it resumes without any sort of drop in the intensity. So basically, it's what we talk about to outsiders, to ourselves, and what we talk about to outsiders are completely different things. It's also, everybody in the household knows everybody's secrets. All mail is read out loud. Even the little kids are sort of present to this. Everyone in that family has their own position. This is their seat at the table. This is their room, and so on. So it's this. Obviously, there's the dynamics of parent and child and different aspects to it, but it's. So it's not like a pure democracy, but it is a very cohesive unit. And that's one of the structures. So households as these little planets. And then you rarely go visiting in someone else's house. Men rarely go visiting in someone else's house. For one thing, it's so much work. There's so much labor to be done that leisure time is few and far between. Even if the fishery is not active, whether on a specific day because the weather is bad or out of season, there's typically so much work to be done, repairing nets, doing all the other chores that are required for fishing, that leisure is limited. If it does happen, it typically happens among men in public areas. On Sundays, so that's when they will gather and have some kind of interaction, some kind of chat. Women more likely to visit house to house for like cups of tea and so on, and in large part, it's often within the context of borrowing a cup of molasses or those things, or maintaining, because you can make an argument that Chiaramonte isn't necessarily that interested in the dynamics of women in the community, in large part because he's interested in the sort of the the economy and how it relates to the fishery, and so the sort of domestic economy slightly less so. But to be fair, I haven't read his longer work, so maybe he addresses it there. But I mean, women tend to be more mobile in outports, and I think it's Gerald Pocius in his work on Calvert, which came out about 10 years after this, or the field work for it was conducted about 10 years after this. He points out that men tend to stay in communities and women are often coming from other communities, so they have different kinds of bonds to associate with. And of course, they will move households, so they will have sisters and things, whereas the men tend not to in the same way, and different geographical relationship. So they have little dyadic relationships, and dyad is another way of approaching it. So you have, again, the household, and then you have the men in relationship, and each man basically has a relationship with every other man in that community, and it is based on their actual history of interactions. It's not based on their purported role. So he stresses that a person will have a relationship with the shopkeeper by virtue of all the interactions they've had with that shopkeeper, not by virtue of their status or their role as shopkeeper. So, and no one wants to be in any kind of sense of imbalanced obligation. I think the idea is that everyone is, most people are sort of fundamentally independent, yet realize that independence isn't always possible and that collaboration is often required. Borrowing tools, borrowing additional labor, borrowing some kind of assistance from people. I know borrowing assistance is a strange way of saying it, but let me just use that verb, is required. And you do that with individuals. You have who you were in some kind of specific relationship with, and probably the ones who you have greater trust with and greater bonds. And you can have stronger and weaker relationships, and you can have severed relationships as well, which is a thing to consider. But you don't want that sort of cosmic balance sheet to ever get out of whack. So people keep fierce track of the obligations that they have to each other. And basically, if those obligations are balanced out, then the community runs smoothly. And so those are the kind of interactions that are happening. So you don't have much in the way of leisure. The leisure that you do have is typically related to Sundays. You don't have much in the way of drinking. You don't have much in the way of sort of joyousness or boisterousness. Yes, there's the occasional wedding. Yes, there's the occasional wake, but those are few and far between. And then Christmas happens. And Christmas is a calendar custom, of course, and it has the Christian story, which you all know and love, or at least vaguely familiar with. But just as importantly, it's this period that is by circumstance, because of weather, by circumstance because of the overarching shutdown that North American society has over the Christmas, New Year's stretch. Where many businesses, many fishing fleets will return, and then by consensus, the 12 days of Christmas, this period is a time for play. It is a time for leisure. It is a time for socializing. It is a time for carousing. So the other 353 days of the year are fairly hard scrabble, fairly dour, fairly severe in terms of the formality of relationships. It's not that this community is hostile to itself. It is just austere because it's about balancing out obligations and so on. So it's living within these difficult circumstances and these difficult economic circumstances, and collaboratively creating something together, which requires trust that, when broken, can lead to, at the very least, hard feelings. And then mumming happens, and social drinking happens. And so social drinking is, on one hand, it's an opportunity to drink, and you don't necessarily need to rationalize that too much. Remember, when we talk about calendar custom, when we talk about all folklore, the element of fun is present, and fun is a justification in and of itself. And you have these two major things: the social drinking, where basically people, men, go house to house in groups, maybe as much as every day, but certainly in clumps. And they will go from house to house, and they will hang out, and they will be sociable, and they will be gregarious, and they might dance, they might sing, but it's like a pub crawl. They're basically going on a pub crawl. And then if they get invited in, because they still need to ask permission. If they get invited in, they are offered drinks. But the offering is they're not demanding drinks. Remember when I said earlier that I would get back to that sort of demanding candy that Halloween has? There's not a demand. There is an offer, and one at a time, the host will offer a drink and to each an individual person, and they will have a drink, then they will stop. And everyone is, in their social, perhaps slightly drunken haze, everyone is basically taking some kind of tally about, all right, I now owe this person a drink. Or conversely, I'm at their house because they owe me a drink. And so, are we under obligation, or are we liquidating an obligation as we do this? Are we creating a new one, or are we erasing an old one that they have? So all that is taking place. There's a certain kind of mathematics to it. There are also social events that take place in the Orange Lodge, the hall, a place where there might be social events throughout the entire year. Not with a regularity as over the 12 days of Christmas, where there's typically something happening every night there, but there is a sort of a center spot. So not all entertainment takes place in the home. It takes place at the sort of the neutral, collaborative community space. But for mumming and at this time, importantly is that people are going into each other's houses, which doesn't typically happen. Men don't visit to other people's houses without some kind of instrumental cause, like the borrowing of a tool or something. So the social spaces, the houses become reconfigured as social spaces within these times. Then there's mumming, where mumming is and social drinking are kind of interrelated. And it's interesting because, again, I think because of the priorities that he has, he starts with men mumming as a extension of the social drinking. So basically you have drinking as the activity, dictated by the time of year, but then you have a performative aspect that can be added upon it. And he emphasizes that often mumming is a spontaneous thing. It's like, well, shall we mum instead? And then they get to wear outfits. And when they do that, just like in Halloween, just like in any kind of costume, once they have entered into some kind of disguise and they have brought the idea that they are now doing performance, once you're in a costume that is clearly identifiable as costume, especially when there are really only two costume themes, the fisherman or the woman, so kind of drag, as it were, and then a kind of a oversimplification of the standard standard wear, but also opportunity for female to male drag. You have once you have someone showing up in costume and disguising, the idea that they are in disguise, and that part of the joy of mumming is, or part of the festivity, the part of the game that is mumming, is trying to get your identity guessed. And it's not like you win or lose if it doesn't happen. You can get a certain amount of joie de vivre if you aren't guessed, but if you aren't guessed, then you never take your mask off, or eventually you will reveal your mask, and then you don't get the drink. So there's kind of that play in mind. But it's fun, and when you do so, you can be ruder, and people can be ruder to you. There's a lot of sort of touching and poking that takes place. It's like, padding. Are you? And it can be. You can make an argument that it's an aggressive play, but certain forms of. Well, I guess the idea is that there's sort of an implied consent in that it's like, are you a woman? Let me sort of touch the things and see what happens, and. licenses given at that time to figure it out. So you have these groups that go out and do this, and they enter into the house, and they talk in ingressive breath. And he doesn't actually explain what ingressive breath is, but he mentions it a couple of times. But I can't do it very well, but I'm going to do it. It's when you talk while inhaling. So you're talking like this the whole time, which is a pretty good way of disguising a voice. If you want to talk like this, you're used to my mellifluous tones, are you not? And then if I go like this, it's like, oh, what happened to mellifluous Ian? Well, he was using ingressive breath. So, and that's a good way of disguising. Obviously, the answers are also fairly short because you don't want to be doing paragraphs in that. Anyway, so things get guessed. But nevertheless, the mask comes off. And just like in social drinking, you then get offered drinks one at a time. And like, okay, if I'm going to offer you a drink, you need to be, your disguise needs to be taken off, because this is still, as festive as this is, as joyous as this is still within the process of obligation. This is still within the process of keeping this balance sheet more or less in check. And so I think because he's basically dealing with the social relationships, the dyadic social relationships of men in this small community. Each man in that community has a relationship with the other 84. So that's how many? 84 times. There's an awful lot of different dyadic relationships in this community, and they're all. This is one of the opportunities to maintain it. And those are the types that he goes. He introduces like the type of groups that go mumming, and there's the single male mummer, which is kind of rare. And the single male mummer eventually tends to join another mumming group, and then moves in. And so type 2 is really the one, not the largest one, the one he pays most attention to, and that's a group of mummers. He also notes, just as an interesting aside, he also notes that when drinking happens, it's very socially not done to drink alone, and it's even rare to drink with two people. Drinking is a social activity with 3 or more people. Drinking is not a dyadic relationship. So the drinking doesn't take place within these dyadic relationships. It takes place within the groups, which are already a whole bunch of complex dyads. So the male group is the largest contingent of mummers. You don't go social drinking with someone who is your enemy. You don't go social drinking with someone that you have beef with. But if mummers groups join up and someone enters into your group in disguise and then revealed, oh, it's Jim, they'll continue mumming. I was like, well, while we're doing this, we're okay. He doesn't suggest whether doing this actually can be something that heals a rift, but rather the beef is like momentarily suspended, in part because disguise allows for this. So it's a temporary suspension, a temporary slight suspension of animus that might be coming through the community. Then there are other groups. Women will sometimes go out in dyads, the same kind of dyadic relationships. All the other groups are basically similar to the kind of people who would hang out with each other anyway. So, women, you have bachelor-aged men, so 15 to 20. You have bachelorette, not that he uses those words, so unmarried women, so 14 to 19. You have boys, 8 to 14. You have girls, 8 to 14 or so, and you have little children, and you have the occasional. He includes the people who are basically accompanying the little groups. So those are groups that are already, that their sociability is regular outside of these times. It's like often family of children will go out mumming together, or neighbors will go as a group. The same kind of people that you might go trick-or-treating with is the same kind of thing, and they are much more interested in the play, in the disguising, in the interactions that are about the guessing, and they're not interested in the drinking. large fire. They don't really care if they're. I mean, they like the idea of people not guessing them, because for them it's play. So I think that's why he's foregrounding the men doing it, because it is a play with a certain amount of tacit instrumentality. And fundamentally, this is about this is the it's not one performance. But when we talk about calendar custom, it's the group coming together as a group through a particular joint narrative, which is, in this instance, the Christmas season. And we all share in this time. This time is at least in certain parts of us, this is a sacred time where we reflect on this narrative that informs who we are and informs our sense of self. But that's the opportunity for it, and that opportunity then might have other things attached to it. So it's not simply the nativity story, but it is the mumming tradition. So those sort of symbols and these things that are, we do them because our group has done them before. And that is important because it's about marking cyclical time. And the group, as I keep on saying, the group reaffirming its sense of self to each other through artistic forms. And he actually ends with this idea. The men who went drinking together and the various types of mummers which I have described have used the Christmas season to cement and reinforce the bonds established in their workaday lives. Mummering not only involves the community in an intriguing guessing game, it requires identification of the people who are playing the game. The community takes stock of its members. Many may not have visited any of the houses on the other side of the harbor since the last funeral or wedding. In particular, young children are named and their growth appraised. Christmas in Deep Harbour can be viewed then as an event in which the community reaffirms its identity. So that's exactly the kind of thing that I talk about when I talk about calendar custom. In that, on one hand, and it's interesting where he talks about the children in that aspect, and talking about their growth, because it is the idea that the community is constantly changing because we exist in linear time. People are marrying, children are born, children are growing, children are becoming adults, they are marrying, other people are dying, other people are disappearing. The group sometimes has to disperse for work. Sometimes people are away for as long as 2 months, sometimes people are away for as long as 11 months, but everyone comes home at this time, and the group as the community, the outport as a town, is all present to each other. Perhaps too large to meet in the same place, but that's why you go from house to house. And it's about the individuals, that the group is comprised of individual members, and we reaffirm our connection to those individual members while simultaneously, performatively, reaffirming the group itself. Individual group, individual group. You don't have a group without a bunch of individuals. You don't have a bunch of individuals getting together unless they feel cohered into a sense of group. And despite the fact that things change, there's a cyclical time. There's a literal the cycle of the year, and those two senses of time, that no matter how much this progress is happening, this progress is still going on. And it's just a lovely little reading, and it hammers home this idea, and it turns it a little bit into some kind of functionalism. And I don't want that to be the last impression, that there's an intentionality that's happening here, and that, oh, this is the time of year when we go to each other's houses and we reaffirm our bonds to each other. Because and it's not that if that is pointed out, people wouldn't be able to comprehend that, but in part it's the spontaneity of it. And it's weird to talk about spontaneity and tradition at the same time, but in part it's the lived habit of this tradition is doing just that, and therefore it really doesn't require the reflection of theory. It's not beyond their capabilities, it's beyond their immediate concern to theorize what they're doing. They are having fun, they're visiting, they are guising, they are mumming, they are drinking, they're celebrating Christmas, and us anthropologically inclined folklorists can use all the fancy terms we want, and come to a parallel conclusion. But it's a group getting together, reaffirming itself. All right. What a great article. Isn't it great? It's lovely. And this is old. This is 1969. The fieldwork was done in 1963. And yet, apart from the fact that communities like this don't exist anymore, this is a very modern sounding article. And it reinforces the idea that the folk are not following traditions because they like tradition in some kind of weird way. They are following tradition because they are ongoingly important and meaningful, and they are ongoingly apt, and they ongoingly continue to serve so many different purposes, including, of course, the purpose of fun, which we shall not forget. And we shall not forget when we muse yet again on Louis J. Chiaramonte's Mumming in Deep Harbour, aspects of social organization in mumming and drinking, about which I have been talking to you today. My name is Ian. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.